Hello, and welcome then to our second talk in the series on the 5 principles and the threefold practice and the middle way network. So just before I start my talk here, which is on the theme of skepticism, I just want to mention, well, first of all, the context in which this is taking place. So maybe some people have been watching these videos but aren't very aware of how they happen and when they happen. So this is happening in a Zoom meeting, which happens every month. So it's now on Tuesdays in the evening, 7:30 in the evening UK time. So if you're interested in joining these meetings, you can sign up to join the Middle Way Network on the Middle Way Society website. That's middlewaysociety.org. I'd also like to mention that I'm speaking now from Tyrwellyn House in Wales, which is where we've established a retreat centre where we can hold Middle Way Society retreats. And there is a series of 5 retreats over the year on the 5 principles that I'm talking about, where you can go into more depth and practice together in a lovely environment in the countryside. We've also got planted woods and a forest garden at the retreat centre. So if you're interested in that, please have a look at our website, Tyrwellyn House, that's TIRYLAN house.org. Just search Tyrwellyn House. Okay, but now I'm going to get on with the talk. So this is the second talk in the series, which is concerned with a breakdown, really, an analysis of what's involved in the middle way, as I've arrived at over more than 20 years of work on the subject. It's an analysis of the middle way that's intended to be practically helpful. That's the entire orientation of the thing, even though it does engage with intellectual debates as well, but for practical purposes. So the first talk that I did on this series, which is available on YouTube, is on the middle way as a universal principle. So that clarifies some of the relationship between the idea of the middle way as a universal and the Buddhist, traditional Buddhist version of it. It also discusses the idea of absolutization, which is central to how I understand the point of the middle way. So absolutization is the underlying problem, if you like. So absolutization, just to very briefly recap on what I said last time, is the tendency to think we have the whole story at each given moment of judgment. And it's also, you could briefly encapsulated as the source of dogma, repression, and conflict. So it links those things together. So if we think we've got a whole story, we've got a dogma, and we repress alternative points of view, either in ourselves or in others, and that creates conflict both in ourselves and others. So there's a whole set of interlinked loops that can follow from that. So to respond effectively to absolutization, I argued last time, we need the middle way. So middle way is kind of defined as an effective response to absolutization, whatever that is. You can find more detail about this in my book called Absolutization. But there are 4 criteria that I suggested for an effective middle way, which it needs to involve practicality, an aspiration to universality, a judgment focus, and an error focus. So we're not just spinning an abstract or speculative theory. It's intended to be effective and to assist our inspiration and responsibility. We're working up to universality from experience, not top down. We're focusing on judgment, how we change things from one moment to the next. And the error focus is, it can be more effective to focus on what we do wrong. Not obviously, we still need inspiration, positive inspiration, but the area of focus is rather than trying to get completely, absolutely right theories in the first place and just follow those, rather than working top down from a positive ideal as an absolute, we work the other way, as it were. So we recognize some issues that we have and errors that we're making and work with those. So that's a rough sketch of what I think any middle way approach does, and that can help us identify what is a middle way approach and what isn't. So we can practice the middle way at any point of judgment, starting from where we are right now. Obviously, we need to be inspired by a meaningful idea of what we're trying to do, but that doesn't have to be an absolute belief about it. We don't have to start with absolute enlightenment, for example, and deduce things down from that. We have a rough idea of what we're trying to do and an inspiration towards it. But the practicalities, how do we judge differently? So the 5 principles, which I'm now embarking on, are all about the nuts and bolts of how we do it differently, how we can judge in a middle way fashion rather than getting caught up in absolutization, rather than thinking we have the whole story, recognizing that we don't and responding appropriately, adjusting our approach appropriately. So the 5 principles and the threefold practice offer a structure which suggests how we can judge things differently, practically speaking. So this is the first session on that, and there'll also be a further 9 sessions which are exploring the 5 principles in varying amounts of detail, but obviously an average of 2 sessions on each principle. So there'll be 2 sessions on skepticism to start with. And skepticism then is the first principle, which is the recognition of uncertainty. Okay, so whatever other associations you may have with the word skepticism, you might need to put some of them aside, depending on your cultural background and training and so on, in order just to focus on that idea. It's the recognition of uncertainty in practice, in our experience. Not that it doesn't have philosophical aspects to it, but I'm going to try and subordinate those to the practical point of it. Okay, so let's start with that idea of recognizing uncertainty and unpack that a bit. So skepticism as a practice. So skepticism is a practice. It involves recognizing uncertainty, that is not just intellectually, but also emotionally, and recalling it when we need it. So there's an aspect of maintaining continuity of our awareness of uncertainty. So doing that, recognizing uncertainty continually is of huge practical value, practically speaking. And if we just start to reflect on learning, for example, so how do we learn? How do we acquire any new understanding of anything? Well, if we think we've got the whole story to start with, we're not going to learn anything. Yeah, so learning depends on uncertainty, just on recognizing we haven't got the whole story. We still got something to learn at any point. And it's only by learning that we can adapt to new conditions. So if we think we know all about the world and what we do in it and what we ought to do and so on, then we're not going to adapt. So if we try and connect those ideas, uncertainty, learning, adaptation. You can't have adaptation without learning. You can't have learning without uncertainty. So we have to start, I think, with uncertainty, just because absolutization tends to block us from learning, tends to block us from adapting. So if we can remain uncertain, then we can avoid that loop, that reinforcing feedback loop. Now, it's relatively easy to recall uncertainty in the case of what has been called known unknowns. So there were certain things we might well recognize as being uncertain. Yeah. So the weather tomorrow, for example. So where I'm sitting in South Wales, the weather forecast currently says that it will snow tomorrow, which is a new development. It hasn't snowed very much this winter. Of course, it could be wrong. And any meteorologist will acknowledge that, I think, that the weather forecast is fallible. Unexpected things can happen, whether it can be slightly wrong, it can be bigly wrong. So we don't have any particular problem with those things, perhaps, but it's much harder and it requires much more deliberate practice to recognize unknown unknowns. Now, that was a phrase made somewhat notorious by Donald Rumsfeld in the context he used it in, but the general idea of an unknown unknown was not invented by him, and it's a much wider applicability. Basically, it's the idea that we're accustomed to thinking that we know things, a lot of things, and we usually don't recognize where we're wrong in the important ways. We're taken by surprise, usually after things have gone wrong. So in order to be able to deal with unknown unknowns, we need a general awareness of uncertainty. It can't just be certain things are uncertain, like the weather. It's got to be much wider, more general awareness that everything, and I mean everything, we think we know might be wrong. And that's what skepticism is all about. It's that wide, total recognition that anything we think we're wrong, anything we think we know may be wrong. Thus, in that sense, there's no such thing as knowledge. Skepticism traditionally has questioned whether there can be knowledge, and on the basis of uncertainty. So we can't predict when we're going to need awareness in advance, so therefore at least we can't assume that we know. So the kind of tools for that reflection, the tools for becoming aware of unknown unknowns are skeptical arguments. So skeptical arguments can give us a series of reflections for recognizing uncertainty in all situations. And they're always in the form of basically, because of such and such, we don't know whether or not we're right, or wrong. So I think the mistake that people very often make with these is to assume in some way or other that they are saying, we know we're wrong, which is not the case. So no skeptical argument is telling you you're wrong. It's not telling you you're right, obviously, but it's not telling you you're wrong either. And it's that in-between point, that uncertainty, which is distinctive recognition behind the middle way, that remaining in that space of not knowing whether you're right or wrong. That space allows you to be pretty damn confident that you're right in some circumstances, or even pretty damn confident that you're wrong. But that's different from a total certainty. Now, just to break down a little bit then, what skeptical arguments there might be. There are basically three traditional types of skeptical argument. So here we're drawing on the philosophical tradition, largely as it's developed in the West, but you can also find some of this stuff in Buddhist philosophy, for example. So three kinds of arguments: empirical, rational, or linguistic. So the empirical arguments, the empirical is to do with the senses and the information we get from the senses. So empirical skeptical arguments help us recognize that we don't get knowledge, we don't get certainty from the senses or from our other experiences. we can be justified in believing things on the basis of what we see or hear, or even what we intuit. But that's not the same as being certain because, for example, we've seen something. We could be obviously mistaken in our interpretation of what we have experienced. So that's I'll come back to empirical arguments in a moment. Rational skeptical arguments are ones that help us recognize that all our beliefs depend on fallible assumptions. So rather than focusing on the senses or experience, the form of experience, it focuses on the assumptions we make when we interpret that experience. And when we make assumptions, there's no guarantee of any assumption. And there's a whole load of, again, philosophical arguments that could support that. But the underlying realization there is that all our beliefs depend on fallible assumptions. There's no way out of that. The difficulties, or well, I don't think they're difficulties, but if you like, the uncertainty that creates for us. Then the third type of argument is linguistic. So that's recognizing that the language we use to describe our beliefs can't just represent reality. So this is an alternative way into skepticism, if you like. You could just use this by itself, in fact, and without the other arguments, because it will do the job. It's an alternative way of doing the job. If we reflect language we use to describe what we believe or what we think we know, because of the way in which we understand and use that language in our bodies, using our bodies, can't be a representation of reality. And again, I'll come back to exactly why that's the case. Okay, so a little bit first a bit more detail on the empirical arguments. So there are quite a range of these. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about these arguments, but just to give you an idea of the range of them. So some of the most famous ones are the dream argument and the error argument. So the dream argument basically says, you don't know that you're not dreaming right now. You don't know, in other words, that you're not under a total delusion. You don't know whether you are or not. Yeah, so this isn't a claim that you are dreaming right now, it's a claim that you might be. It's also prompts to reflection, that your certainty about the fact that you're awake and experiencing reality in some sense may be wrong. There's the possibility that it may be wrong. There's also a more modern version of that is the brain in the vat. So the idea that you might be a brain floating in a vat run by some mad scientist somewhere, which is connected by a load of electrodes to the sense experiences that you have, and as depicted in the film The Matrix, pretty much, or version of it anyway. So yeah, that's just really a reminder. I think as you can get into complexities and rationalizations around that argument, but I don't want to do that. I want to stick with the practical direction. But practically, I think that kind of argument is a reminder of uncertainty. Similarly, the error argument. So the error argument is just a reflection that you've made errors in the past. I've made errors in the past. We've all made errors of one kind or another. We've, for example, mistaken people's intentions. We've even mistaken objects. So great example for me is on a hike in Lapland, I came into a clearing and I saw a bear. I was terrified. And then crept a little closer with a little bit of doubt coming in. I found it was a log covered in moss. So I was deluded, yeah? I made a mistake, which makes me a bit more aware of the possibility of making more mistakes in the future. Also, if we reflect on the limitations of our senses, so we are situated, so we're only in a particular place. even if our senses are effectively extended by, remote cameras and such like, videos and so on, we're still situated. There's limitations to what we can see and hear and smell and so on. Our senses have a limited range. I can't see beyond a certain distance. A limited distinctness, a limited granularity. I can't see beyond a certain amount of detail. Same applies to the other senses. My senses only operate on a certain wavelength. So unlike bees, as I understand it, I can't see in ultraviolet. Our wavelengths limit what we can experience, but maybe all sorts of things going on at different wavelengths that we're just not aware of because we're not equipped to pick up those signals at all. There's a whole load of grounds for thinking that we may be wrong, that we may be ignorant, because we're only tuned in a very narrow frequency, you could say. And of course, we only we're constantly dependent on interpretation of what our senses tell us. And that also relates to issues of attention, the limitations of our attention. So there's the famous gorilla experiment, of course, where people were asked to watch a basketball game and count the passes. And in the middle of the basketball game, a guy came in a gorilla suit and did a dance and went off again. And lots of people didn't notice because they were looking at the passes in the basketball game. So glaring things, weird things, totally miss our attention. Our brains only process, a very small fraction of what we could conceivably sense. So there was all these limitations. We could go on at some length about these, but basically we're limited. Our senses are limited. Our ability to get information from the world is limited. So the chances of being wrong are actually pretty high. At least they're certainly high enough to remain uncertain about what we think we're getting. Then let's go on then to the rational arguments. So the rational arguments, what's distinctive about these is that obviously there are some claims that people make which they may argue are not subject to empirical resolution. So mathematical claims are one of those. So one thing that often comes up in relation to this is, yeah, but don't we know that 2 + 2 = 4? Now then, this is where the rational skeptical arguments kick in. So it simply points out that all our beliefs depend on other beliefs. And very often also, those beliefs are part of an interdependent network. So with 2 + 2 = 4, well, that's part of an interdependent network known as mathematics, in which there's a whole load of consistent rules that all prop each other up. So within that system of rules and the models that are used in mathematics, sure, 2 + 2 = 4, but that's not an absolute certification of the whole model or its relationship to a reality outside that model. So that's the problem when we try and find certainty through finding a foundation of some kind. So we think we've found the source of truth, whether that's a religious revelation or an infallible source or a rational rule which must be true, whether that's philosophical or religious or mathematical or whatever. You can, whatever foundation people might claim to have can always be questioned. You can always ask, well, why should we assume that's absolutely true? Maybe there's good grounds for believing it, but that's not the same as it being absolutely true in all circumstances. And for practical purposes, we may accept, obviously, that 2 + 2 = 4 and lots of other claims, but that's not the same as them being certain. So if we try and find certainty, we usually end up with either infinite regression. So one claim is certified by another one, by another one, by another one, and we can never find the final claim in the series. Or by circularity, so we end up going round and round in circles. So, the Bible must be true because God told us it is, but the Bible tells us about God and so on. So we go round and round in the same circles. So that's the rational arguments. The advantage of those is that they deal with certain supposedly purely rational arguments that empirical arguments don't deal with. And then there's the linguistic arguments. Now I'm going to go into the relationship between skepticism and meaning more in the second talk of this series. So I'll come back to this a bit more then next time. But basically, if we take an embodied view of meaning, which there are all sorts of reasons for doing, then we recognize that meaning is associative and depends on our bodies. So when we find something meaningful, we have an experience of associating a symbol with an experience. Yeah, so we, which physiologically can be understood as a neural link between that experience and the symbols that we've connected to it. So meaning is associative, and that means when we have a sense of something being meaningful, including all the language we use, that's specific to us, specific to people, and specific to the time when we have that experience of meaning. It's not a universal connection to reality. Our bodies don't allow that. Our bodies just don't work in that way. But the whole idea of knowledge, of certainty, depends on representation. So the idea that we can create propositions out of language, so sentences about what is the case, and that these have a one-to-one relationship with reality. So if that's mistaken, then we can't be certain. So that's another way into the issue. But as I say, I'll say more about embodied meaning in the next talk. So that's the three types of skeptical arguments. So now, in a way, that's way more than we need, and that's, I think, one of the great things about skeptical arguments is that they are what's known technically in philosophy is overdetermined. So they're overdetermined, meaning that we've got way more of them than is necessary to do the purpose. Yeah. So if the purpose of the skeptical arguments is to remind us of uncertainty, then all we need is one skeptical argument, basically one that works for the thing that we need to find uncertain. That means, we could do well with only one of the types of skeptical argument quite often. If you're not that fussed about some of them, then you can forget about them and just rely on the ones that work for you, if you like. All we need is enough understanding of skeptical arguments to remind us of, in a practical way, of our uncertainty. But say there's quite a choice, so take your pick. It's a big box of chocolates. You can decide which skeptical arguments are going to work for your purposes. Now, for as I mentioned, certain kinds of claims which don't respond to empirical arguments. So that's why you may need to draw on at least two of the three types of argument, perhaps. So what are known as a priori claims, not just maths, but also ones based on logic, depend on either the rational or the linguistic types of skeptical argument. Okay, so philosophers have long been obsessed with trying to overcome or disprove those skeptical arguments. And they haven't succeeded. Now, I'm not going to go into in this talk why they haven't succeeded, because that would take us on a long journey down lots of philosophy. But just my view that I've arrived at on this is just they're unanswerable. And for every philosopher that offers you an answer to skeptical argument, there'll be lots of others who point out the flaws with that answer to skeptical argument and why it isn't one. So yeah, it's probably best dealt with on a case-by-case basis. If you think you've got an answer, then you can look up the responses to it. But the bigger point here is that really, I think philosophers are deeply mistaken in looking for answers. There's been a misunderstanding of skepticism and its implications behind the quest for disproof of skeptical arguments. So skepticism isn't a problem. It's not problems we overcome. It's a useful practice. So it's a prompt to recollection of uncertainty in order to adapt better to the things that our experience throws up, that the world throws at us. So it started off, I mean, there are various contexts where it has been used in that practical way, more or less, such as the Buddhist tradition and the Pyrrhonist tradition. There are still philosophical issues around those traditions and the way they use it sometimes, but yeah, generally speaking, there is the realization there that skepticism is practical. But most modern philosophers just don't engage with that, in my experience. They see skeptical argument as a set of abstract claims which they then have to disprove. But yeah, so in order to kind of recognize why they don't need disproving, another key thing is that we recognize that skepticism is not negative. So that's my next main point. So skepticism is not negation. And obviously skepticism has become very much associated both popularly and philosophically with denial. Yeah, so for example, a climate skeptic is someone who denies climate change usually. I mean, in Britain, we used to have people called Eurosceptics who didn't believe in the EU, but now they've become Brexiteers. Yeah, so we got this is popular use or widespread use of the word skeptic, meaning somebody who denies a widely held position, perhaps. Obviously, that's not the kind of skepticism we're talking about here. But it's derived from the assumption that skepticism is negative. But if you just look at skeptical arguments themselves, yeah, so just think about the implications of skeptical argument. Skeptical argument doesn't justify any negative belief, because any positive belief that is questioned by a skeptical argument can also be equally well applied to a negative one. Yeah. So yeah, take a whether you're talking about very abstract metaphysical beliefs like God exists, or is there a book over there, you know, very everyday beliefs, either of those, you know, you could just as well use skepticism to question whether God doesn't exist or whether the book doesn't lie over there. Yeah, there's always just as much of a flip side. So skeptical arguments just remind us of that in-betweenness, that we can't be certain either way. But for some reason, people have huge difficulty remembering this point, even though obviously philosophers have pointed it out from time to time. Another way of approaching this is to reflect on the fact that there are two types of no. So the word no can just mean that you don't affirm something. If somebody asks you a question and you say no, it might just mean, well, you don't affirm what they're saying. Or it might mean that you believe the opposite. You may be affirming the opposite. So, for example, if somebody asked, do you believe there are little green men on Mars? You could say no, meaning, no, I don't believe that. So I fail to have that belief in little green men on Mars. Or you could answer no, meaning, no, of course there are no little green men on Mars, meaning I affirm the belief that there are no little green men on Mars. Yeah, and those are different claims. Yes, so in the first instance, you're open to the possibility that there could be further evidence of little green men on Mars, possibly, maybe very unlikely, but it's possible. In the second, you are committing yourself to denial of the claim. So we tend to confuse those two types of no. And I think the basic reason for this is that we've got well set up kind of deeply entrenched neural routes for denial. Yeah, so it's much easier to process a denial. It's an easy shortcut. So no generally means opposition to the thing that you are saying no to. And this point is very much underlined by George Lakoff, who's written a book called Don't Think of an Elephant. And he points out that if you tell someone not to think of an elephant, then, of course, what they like you to do immediately is think of an elephant. So the negation there actually reinforces the meaning, doesn't it? It reinforces the idea of an elephant. I mean, the other example there that Lakoff gives was when Richard Nixon said I am not a crook. He reinforced the belief across the US that he was a crook. So basically denial tends to be more meaningful to us. So often we let that meaning dictate our belief. Whereas if we're going to neither believe nor disbelieve, if we're going to maintain a continuing awareness of uncertainty, then a more complex formation is needed, which allows for third possibilities. And that's a bit more demanding, which is why it's a practice. So in a way, it's not surprising that anyone who hasn't really engaged with that practice in one way or another, the various ways of engaging with it, but anyone who hasn't engaged with that practice, doesn't get it really, or doesn't get that distinction, however important it is. Okay, so, I mean, there are various kinds of responses people make. I don't want to go on too long because I could go into a lot of detail here, necessary detail, but yeah. Yeah, I mean, I could talk about Occam's razor, but I don't think I'm going to. So that's in the book if you want to go into it. Yeah, let's go on to the idea of just the cultural reinforcement of that yes versus no as denial. Yeah, the application of binary logic. Yeah, so now I would emphasize here that it's the application of binary logic. So you don't have to change your logic at all to take skepticism seriously. You don't need fancy logic. But you just have to not apply binary logic in a rigid way to every eventuality. So binary logic applied in a rigid way leads us only to focus on the state of affairs out there. So is it true or not? Is Richard Nixon a crook, or is he not a crook? Is he innocent? One or the other. That's the state of affairs. What we tend not to reflect on is the more complex thing involving us. So we're here making a judgment about this. Well, what do we know about Richard Nixon and whether he's a crook or not? And what biases do we have that might come into play here, which might lead us to think one thing or another rather too fast? So we're involved here. So the key reflection is, are we in a position to know whether it's true or not? To which the answer, according to the skeptical argument, is always going to be no, we're not in a position to know because we're embodied and finite and so on. So we don't have a perspective that allows us to be certain about these things. Binary logic is fine if you're only talking about states of affairs in the abstract, but when you try and incorporate or recognize your own role in the system, your own role in the situation, and that you're looking on it, making judgments about it, then it's not enough just to stick with yes or no, true or false all the time. You have to pan back, and you may still use logic in a sense, but you will use it in a more subtle, nuanced way. We're always stuck, practically speaking, we're always stuck with our engagement in that situation, because every situation involves us making a judgment, maybe along with lots of other people, maybe in relation to a tradition of thought, but still there's a judgment going on, not just what is true or false out there. Okay, and there is a famous argument for treating uncertainty as denial. So people often come up with this, particularly in relation to God. And this is the argument of Russell's teapot. So Bertrand Russell, who was an early 20th century philosopher, argued that, well, there might be a teapot orbiting the sun and out there in the solar system, somewhere in the asteroid belt. Maybe there's a teapot, just a tiny teapot. And basically, we don't know whether or not there's a teapot orbiting in that place. But he argued we should act as though there's no such teapot, because we've got no evidence that there is such a teapot. It's just a fanciful idea. So he compared that with God. So he said, I've got no more reason to believe in God than I have to believe in this teapot. So I might as well say it doesn't exist. I might as well conclude that it's false, deny it. So that was his argument for atheism. So the belief that God is false, that there isn't a God, rather than agnosticism. What he missed there, I think, crucially, is the practical relevance and the meaning. So he was only considering the teapot in the abstract. Is it true? Is it false? Is it out there? What's the chances of it being out there, etc. But the teapot is of no practical relevance to us. We're not going to, retrieve it to pour tea, so make tea. So it's not related to our experience, and it's not particularly meaningful outside this example. Very unlike God, who is very meaningful to a lot of people. So practical relevance and meaningfulness are vital in these things. And so this is just an example of how a very abstract approach to this can lead you into all sorts of, irrelevant ways of thinking, I think, in which there are lots of arguments about skepticism, which lead us back into those binaries, into true and false and so on. But if we're trying to take a practical approach, I think we need to instead take it seriously, take skepticism seriously. Okay, but being even-handed, so treating the no of skepticism as uncertainty, and treating negative claims as uncertain takes practice. And the practice of agnosticism, which is the fourth principle, which obviously I'll go more into later in the series. So that is really that practice. So it's that practice of staying in the middle when there's lots of perhaps highly charged group supported argument for truth and falsity and good and bad and lots of duality going on. So there's a lot more to say about that practice, but this is where skeptical argument, the implications of skeptical argument lead us, I think, that we need a practice of agnosticism. But if we're going to apply skepticism, basically, usually this involves two phases. So there's two phases of criticism, if you like. First, we might doubt a positive claim, and then we also doubt the negative opposite. So we usually, we can't deal with them both at once, absolutely simultaneously, at least. We usually have to think, oh, well, don't really believe that. And then we think of the opposite and think, well, I don't believe that either. And we end up somewhere in the middle. Doesn't matter so much where exactly in the middle as just that it's somewhere in the middle. It's not in the absolutes. We're then using our experience to justify claims about the subtleties of somewhere in the middle. So the two phases are reflected in the Buddha's early life. The story of the Buddha's early life and the middle way there. So first of all, he lived in the palace. He recognized the limitations of the views of the group in the palace. So those are the positive claims, if you like, in this context. And then he went off into the forest and encountered a whole load of other opposing claims, completely different sets of values about how we should live our lives. And then he began to see the limitations of those as well. So there's a two-phase process, and that's where see the middle way comes into play. Once if we can go through that two-phase process without going straight back to the positive claims in their whole absoluteness, then we begin to find the middle somewhere. Okay, and then final area I want to look at about skepticism. So I've said something about the skepticism is about recognizing uncertainty. Skepticism is not negation, it's not negative. Thirdly, skepticism is practical. Okay, so this again is the calumny really of a lot of traditional philosophical treatments of skepticism, is that they see it as impractical. It's almost, so they start off by seeing it completely abstracted, impractical context. And obviously that's the case for popular discussions of skepticism as well. Yeah, so I'm arguing on the contrary that skepticism is actually extremely practical. It's vitally practical in its full-throated general form. Now, just before I go further with that I just need to note that this is a different kind of argument from an argument about any specific historical school of skepticism. Yeah, so I'm not arguing about the ancient Pyrrhonists or any particular group, just based on where skeptical arguments take us as a practice. I would say it's practical. Yeah. So firstly, skeptical argument is only a threat to absolute assumptions. Yes. So if you have an absolute assumption, it will remind you, if you reflect on the skeptical argument, that actually is uncertain, so you can't hold that absolute assumption. You've got to question it. But if, on the other hand, you have an incremental and provisional belief of some kind, okay, that's fully compatible with skepticism. Nobody's going to tell you not to believe that there's a book in your hand or that it's raining outside or whatever. These are things that you can change your mind about quite easily if something turns out to be different. Yeah, it's relevant for them to be different. So if I think it's raining outside, but I go outside and then it turns out not to be, then I've changed my view easily enough. So it's the absolute assumptions that are the problem, that are the target of skeptical argument. So for that reason, skeptical argument doesn't stop us justifying our beliefs. And it doesn't stop us acting on our beliefs. And it doesn't stop us making appropriate judgments as to how to act based on the weight of evidence, weight of experience. We can do all that and be fully skeptical. Yeah, we remain aware that things are uncertain, but at the same time aware that we've got a whole pile of evidence here telling us, that we should have this belief and not this belief. Yeah. So as far as I'm concerned, for example, in an issue of today, it seems to me there's a whole pile of evidence that Putin's invasion of Ukraine is not justified. Yeah. Now that's a substantial political view that results from that. I don't hold it absolutely. I can still examine further things that come up, but that doesn't mean I can't have quite a strong political view about that. So yeah, that justification can be very practically appropriate and strongly acted on without being confused with knowledge, as long as we remain aware, as long as we remain provisional, remain aware of the alternatives. And when we make a judgment, all we need is a greater weight of justification for one side or the other. Now, I'm going to go into this a lot more when I talk about provisionality later in this series. Yeah, so this whole process of weighing up and how we can do that in a provisional sort of way. But yeah, sometimes the weight of justification is overwhelming. Yeah, so I've got no particular reason to think the opposite at all. Yeah. So practical beliefs about objects in front of me. So there's a mug here. I've got no reason to think this mug is 3D hologram or I'm deluded about it or anything like that. So I've got overwhelming reasons to believe that. So practical beliefs are not threatened by skepticism. And the third principle that I'll go into again later in this series, incrementality, also will help to explore this, I think. So if we see the justification of our beliefs as a matter of degree, that can stretch all the way from pretty damn justified, pretty clear, having plenty of justification for belief, to the opposite of being pretty justified that something isn't acceptable. So near, what we might see as near certainty on either end. But there's still a little squeak of a difference between that and certainty, and that squeak of a difference is important in practical terms, that we maintain an awareness of that difference. So I think that makes skeptical argument fully practical. Then another reflection here is about confidence. So people often reach out for abstract guarantees in order to be confident about something. So for example, they need someone to tell them that something is true before they'll believe it, or they need to believe that God is looking after them or something like this. But these are kind of substitutions, I think. So if we look into confidence and how it's generated, it depends on our bodily states. Obviously, our mental states interacting with our bodies, and the practice that the practices we make of how we practice in relation to those states. So we're confident because of the state of our bodies, and we're able to maintain confident practice, confident judgments and so on when we need them because of that. And also, if you reflect, people who have abstract guarantees or believe they have them aren't necessarily confident. In fact, their confidence can be very brittle. And you get, people like evangelists say, with very strong absolute beliefs, which are, those beliefs have actually turned out to be very fragile when they're very strongly tested by conditions. Yeah, so then they may suddenly flip to the opposite view. Okay, so practical confidence is sustainable, and but trying to find certainty is not. And then there's the recognition that far from being impractical, skeptical argument offers us long-term adaptation. So I'll talk again more in relation to provisionality about adaptation and adaptiveness. But basically, I think if we recognize uncertainty, this provides greater practicality, not less. We can be more effective and also more responsible in relation to the judgments we make. So, and one basic reason for that is that we're more effective if we can bring more energy to what we're doing, and we'll bring more energy to what we're doing if it's not divided, if we're not in conflict about what we believe. So in the longer term, at least, where absolutizations take place, either socially or psychologically, there will be conflict somewhere or other along the line. So if we can resolve conflict, so that's the fifth principle, integration, through avoiding absolutization, then actually, skepticism plays a part in us becoming more practical, able to do things practically better. And finally, I think there's this, well, just the recognition that conditions change. Yes, so our beliefs about things arise in particular conditions, but when the conditions change, we need to change our beliefs. And we're particularly in a phase of change in modern society. I mean, modern society has seen accelerating changes of all kinds, but there are also reasons to believe there may be a lot of even bigger, perhaps catastrophic changes ahead of us very soon, thinking of climate change particularly. So, conditions are likely to change. We need to be able to adapt even more than we ever did before. We'll not be able to adapt if we're not able to question our beliefs and face new ones, which requires awareness of uncertainty. It also requires the ability to imagine and to judge alternatives, which is what's involved in provisionality. So again, I'll say a lot more about that later in this series. So the second principle is provisionality. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up the main points here. So skepticism is I think it's a good starting point for the 5 principles. So it confronts us with how much we may need to adjust our assumptions to practice the middle way. So it lays down the gauntlet, if you like, that this is going to be a challenge. I mean, there's more to say about it. That's why I have a second session, have a talk about skepticism. So things I'm going to focus on in that, applying it non-selectively, its relationship to embodiment, and why people feel that meaning is threatened by skepticism. Why, in fact, skepticism is fully compatible with having meaning, full sense of meaning in what we do. So there are various other things to say, but I've mentioned some of those briefly. Then the connections with other principles have also come up. I've already mentioned the interdependence of skepticism with provisionality, with incrementality, with agnosticism, and with integration. So those 5 principles all interlocked together, dependent on each other. So in some ways, you'll only see the whole picture by connecting them together with each other. So that for that reason, the issues I've raised may seem daunting or overwhelming at this stage. But hopefully I can work through them over the series, and that will help to gradually make them more manageable. So the key thing, I think, is to try and maintain an overview, and maintain an awareness really that skepticism is a practice. So not to get lost in some of the abstract questions that might come up. It's not to say I won't try and respond to them, but they might come up. So I'm going to stop there. That's brief intro to skepticism for now. Any questions or reflections?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. That was really good. I like the three ways, categorizing it as the three ways of skepticism. And as you were talking, I'm like, oh yeah, definitely, I recognize those three aspects, and that made a lot of sense, kind of as a structure. I would definitely describe myself as a hardwired natural skeptic. since I was thinking, since as far as I can remember, I mean, yeah, and I understand why that is now, neurologically, the way I'm wired. But it's like, I remember, even from a very young child, I can't remember a time when I would believe things that adults told me without investigating them myself, which made me a very difficult child for the adults around me. So, you know, and including, I was the first one to like question whether Santa existed, whether Father Christmas existed, and couldn't find any evidence for him, and then went and told the whole school that he didn't exist. And I was the first one, you know, somebody told me, oh, if you pray to God, then you get what you wanted, when I was about 5 years old. I remember being in my room and being like, okay, I'm very, very thirsty and I can't get any more water to drink. I'm going to pray as hard as I possibly can and make this water appear. And God, because, you know, God loves me and he'll want me not to be thirsty. And prayed and prayed and prayed, and obviously no water appeared. And I was like, well, there you go then. That's a load of rubbish, isn't it? So praying doesn't work. That was me 5 years old. So that's the end of that. So yeah, and I think this kind of like natural skepticism is something that I'm interested in. It's something that then led me to, and when you're saying about skepticism being a practical practice, obviously you're probably aware that, you know, I was involved with a very specific version of that, which was, you know, doing insight inquiry, Buddhist insight inquiry, which when I think about it, you know, I was thinking about your talk, is basically a good example of practical skepticism inquiry. So basically it's two people, one person who's guiding and leading another person to question assumptions about certain aspects of the way they view themselves and the way they view reality, to be able to see the unknown unknowns around that they've got, that they're making assumptions around that, and that they didn't realize they were doing. And the reason for doing that is because in the Buddhist tradition, those assumptions are what is causing psychological suffering. So if you do skeptical inquiry in them and then see through them, then that is what gives you insight, which then leads to relief of psychological suffering. And the area I was involved in with that was obviously looking at the nature of the personal self. And so, and literally, and you were saying, you know, you wouldn't necessarily need to go through use all three methods. Well, when we were doing that inquiry, because that was so basically, the longest inquiry I had with somebody was probably 6 months long, and we were talking daily, and it would be literally, you know, I would give them something to look at as a form of the skeptical inquiry using one of these methods, either a bodily thing or a rational argument, and then I would see what their response was, and based on their response would then go, and it was just a kind of natural back and forth, because their natural response would be to try and rationalize or justify, and I could then see what further assumptions they had, and then question them and question them and question And basically what you do is you question and question and question until the brain sort of circuits and realizes there is nothing more. Yeah, can see that these are all assumptions. But blimey, when it comes to that, that is extremely hard work usually, which just goes to show the level of assumptions and that's not been investigated regarding that. So when you say it's practical, yeah, definitely. And if anyone wants an example of that, I always point them to Shepherd's Search for Mind, which is a Buddhist text, which is a lot of Buddhists I've talked to go, oh, that's lovely poetic text. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's literally, again, it's a skeptical inquiry. So there's the shepherd and his guru, and the shepherd comes to his guru and says, I don't understand what the mind is. Help me to understand what the mind is. And the shepherd basically sends him off with all these skeptical inquiries to do. And he comes back and he says, oh, yeah, and then he gives him something else until there's nothing left to look at. So yeah, anyway, I'll leave it there. But so yeah, I totally see the practical value, and it's something I'm still engaged with in other areas. At the moment, I'm looking at what the next step was desire, what they call desire and ill will, or desire and aversion. So yeah. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I mean, that obviously brings foregrounds the kind of therapeutic use of skeptical inquiry, which I've got obviously cognitive therapy of various kinds can be based on that kind of inquiry as well. And I guess, but one of the things I just flag up in relation to those kinds of practices is just to ask yourself also about the framing assumptions of the practices themselves. So where they may possibly differ from skepticism as a whole is if they have framing assumptions in the practice and its goals, which remain unquestioned, but that may or may not be the case.
I mean, there's definitely a thing with you're talking about having to be able to use the skepticism the other way around as well. So something that was always levied was, that it becomes negation in that sort of context. And yeah, that is a real danger that it can end up becoming negation, which is not the goal, it's not the aim at all.
Yeah.
And you have to be very careful to ward against that. Because then, not least because that will lead people into nihilism, which can be quite psychologically dangerous for them. So yeah. But yeah, there's that, and then there's so there's assumptions. There can be assumptions around. I mean, and one of those assumptions, I suppose, which I was wary of as well, was that we used to call it direct experience, so that they would basically, more weight was put on experiential, what you would call experiential, than the other types. So that would be part of the process. It's like, okay, well, the physical senses, what you're confined through them, and what is more or less real than in other ways, which is in itself an assumption which you can question. Yeah,
exactly. If you take the goal of the exercise to be finding reality, then that can.
Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah, especially at that level, it was just to quite literally question the assumptions, the unexamined assumptions around who you think you are, basically.
Yeah. I mean, in the next talk, I'll talk more about the selective use of skepticism, which is a widespread issue. But just to take a traditional example from the the Catholic Church, the Jesuits made a lot of use of skepticism, but only for skepticism against non-Catholic beliefs. So the selective use is I think almost completely different ball game from the non-selective use of skepticism. But obviously there is an intermediate point. There's selective skepticism may be useful for people up to a point where they then have to question the framing assumptions and then not move on to another level of inquiry, if you like.
Yeah, and I also think there's the the thing of when does, because in this tradition as well, then one of the things you have to that's raised and you have to look through is what is called skeptical doubt. And I was thinking, trying to put that in a framework, because skeptical doubt is a different problem, which is you are so skeptical, not skeptical this way, but you're so you end up being paralyzed into inaction by the inability to just go with something, because nothing has any more value or meaning than anything else, so you're just kind of like left in this limbo land where nothing, so that's a real danger as well.
I mean, is that Vicikicca in Buddhist terminology? So I mean, I think skeptical doubt is a terrible translation of that, but it's but I mean, that's, I think, the approach to things which you can associate with relativism and nihilism, that is the assumption that all options are of equal value, so therefore you've got no reason to choose one option over another, which is a sort of, it's an absolutization, but an absolutization of each option being equal when it isn't. When that's actually maybe different weights in experience of these different options we might have. So again, that's another thing we could expand on later, is that skepticism does not imply that kind of relativism or that kind of practical freezing of decision making. Okay, any other responses or questions?
Well, just a couple of things, and thank you for a very thorough and understandable presentation. Really appreciated it. I don't think you mentioned the virtue of curiosity. I see that as quite relevant to the whole thing about skepticism. Do you include curiosity in that ballpark?
I can't say I have explicitly. Do you want to say more about it?
Curiosity is like a wholly positive urge to find out more, and can be a very great help. Now, I'm not just hardwired to skepticism. I'm hardwired to challenging positions, either mentally or, as you know, sometimes directly. But that's like my instinctive reaction to everything. And it's yes, but the yes is a very whispered yes kind of a thing. So it comes out as just but, in a not meant to be a negation, but I'm sure it comes out that way. But to rephrase, if I'm trying to learn to rephrase some of that into, oh, that's interesting, and what about this implication, or something like that, and not just in terms of dialogue with people, but in my own mind, as I go through life, to emphasize curiosity more and more, leads away from nihilism, which can be a tendency to with a skeptical thing.
I guess the way I've talked about that is more emphasized inspiration, which was what the previous series was all about, really, and integration. So if we have kind of a positive attitude to what we're investigating based on our practice of integrating what we're doing, then that's also likely to result in curiosity. So I'd see that as another way of describing it, but a good one.
I think another thing that occurs to me is that skepticism is a tool and needs to be laid down from time to time. And the old thing, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail kind of a feeling. So if I were always skeptical about my wife's faithfulness, for instance, and I can do all the arguments because we lead quite separate lives. So she could be having an affair, I could be having an affair, whatever. But we don't, if we went there, it wouldn't be helpful. Maybe it would be helpful if it were true, but it's much better for the relationship that we just, when we're together, we get along without that kind of a fearful skepticism about the relationship.
I mean, why would skepticism have to be fearful?
Well, I mean, we can't speak for her, I guess, but we get so much out of the relationship. It would be a great loss if it fractured or something like this.
But I mean, I wouldn't take skepticism as implying that loss. If you developed a kind of jealous, negative belief that she was being unfaithful, then obviously that would be damaging. But that's rather different from having an awareness of the possibility, which very often, you might just give no particular time to at all, just drifts by. But
Yeah,
it's
well, that's why I say laying the tool down.
Yeah, okay, if that's where you want to describe it, yeah.
From a pragmatic point of view, it can be very useful to stop being skeptical, or in my case, the way skepticism can work out into a challenging counter statement in a social situation. That's not always welcome by people.
Yeah.
So that in the Sangha I'm part of, that would be a example, because mentally I probably challenge everything that's said in different ways, but if that were my modus operandi, it would not be helpful.
Yeah, indeed. That's a separate issue it's about speech, really, isn't it? How we choose to express skepticism and who to and in what situations. But also in terms of mental states, how much we go into it on particular occasions. Yeah. So there's a balance there with other principles. Sorry.
There's the triviality thing. You don't want to be spending a lot of effort being skeptical when it's not very useful. Like in Scrabble, you look up a word in the dictionary and it proves to be the legitimate word. At that point, a lot of skepticism wouldn't help.
Yeah. But sometimes intractable arguments can arise from people appealing to the dictionary as the ultimate word on the subject, and somebody else has a different view, and so on. But obviously, you don't have to go down that route at all. So it's framed by practicality and judgments about what is practical and what's the most appropriate thing to focus on at the moment, and so on. And that, I think, arises from the interdependence with the other principles, particularly integration. That if we're working on an integrative practice, we don't want to go down a route in the way we behave or what we choose to focus on, which creates a lot of unnecessary conflict as we go.
That's right.
Okay, any other reflections or questions? Okay. And Laura, you're muted.
I apologize for being late.
No problem. Okay, I better get on just then with the practice focus just before we run out. Well, we have run out of time, but I'm going to go on anyway. If you have to drop out because of time, then don't worry about it. But I'm just going to go over 4 questions that you can use for reflection between now and the next session, and possibly for the follow-up session. So as usual, I'll put these all my notes on Slack, and you can see those questions there as well. So the first question, what's your personal experience of skeptical argument and your attitude to it? So we had quite a lot on that from two people who spoke just now, I think. So it's obviously already been reflected on. That might include, when do you use it? And do you tend to interpret it negatively when you do? Second question, what changing conditions have you experienced during your life that have previously meant you had to question beliefs you took for granted? So you might find it helpful to think about when skepticism has been or might have been helpful about something you assumed, particularly a whole set of framing assumptions, the things you took for granted in the past, but then found you were really obliged by conditions to look at things in a different way. Our third question, so choose one skeptical argument. So perhaps the simplest one may be, if you're stuck to choose one, it might be the error argument. Yeah, just the possibility you've made errors in the past, so you might be wrong. But any skeptical argument you like, and reflect on its application to any of your habitual beliefs. So what difference does it make if you apply that argument? Just follow through the implications of it, remembering to avoid absolute negative interpretations, of course. And then finally, fourth question, can you justify your beliefs without feeling that you have to know them? So for example, can you justify, is it your experience you can justify moral beliefs, say about what you should eat or not eat, or political priorities? So I gave you an example of political issue myself, or maybe judgments about how you spend your time. So can you justify things like that on the basis of a weight of evidence or experience without feeling that you have to know what the basis of that judgment is? Okay, so those are some practical things just to be thinking about if you want a focus of reflection. But as I say, various other aspects of skepticism will be explored more in the next session, and then we'll be able to look a little bit more in the round. Okay, any final comments before we finish?